Hello everyone, welcome back. It's Space Engineers Plus Me, episode 19. I'm Enigmius, and today we're diving right in. We're continuing with the build of the aerial module for the blue Behemoth. We've got the ground-based module mostly done. There's probably some room for some tweaking over the next day or two once I get some ideas. But basically it's ready to go. Now we need something that's going to help us get that vehicle around a little bit more easily, possibly a little bit more reliably than trying to get up and down the sides of mountains in the wheeled vehicle. So we're going to build basically a frame for thrusters. This is what it boils down to. We've got plenty of room for onboard storage. We've got a large reactor on board the aerial unit, just like we do the ground-based unit. So when they're connected, we have two large reactors. But it's really kind of pointless without thrusters, so that's sort of our priority right now, is getting the frame in place so that we can add all the thrusters we think we're going to need, get them on board, figure out how much space they're going to take up, how much material they're going to require to build, because the large ones are very, very expensive in terms of materials. Get them all on board, and then we can decide what else we might want to add on to the chassis somewhere. We're going to leave a little bit of room for refineries in case we decide that it's worthwhile to add them in the future. But for now, I want to keep it kind of simple and straightforward. Power, storage, thrusters. Then once we get to a point where we can see how it performs, different weights, different amounts of storage, then we can make some other decisions. You see, these thrusters are absolutely enormous, and they're actually the inspiration for our next build. Is these thrusters, because they take over 1,000 motors each to build one of these thrusters. You can't carry 1,000 motors at a time. The most you can carry is around 400, so you end up doing all these trips back and forth. We encountered the same thing when we built the large reactors. They require 2,000 reactor components, and you can only carry 300 or 400 at a time, so it's just running back and forth. The solution is to build a ship with a ship-sized welder on it, and storage, so that you can put all kinds of different components that you wouldn't normally be able to carry due to their volume and or mass. Put them in the ship, and then use the ship to go around and do all the welding for these massive components that require so many of a particular kind of component. It's kind of a neat little project to take on a small ship that's happily small. It doesn't need to be big for any particular reason. It just needs the very basics: storage, a welder, power supply, and thrusters to get around. But particularly for the large builds like this, when we're talking, 10 large thrusters requiring over 1,000 motors each, if you can afford to make the motors, you can afford to make a ship to weld them so that you don't have to run back and forth all the time, putting them into your regular player inventory. Now this is kind of the finicky business, and it's a little bit tricky to edit when we get down to the spinning of blocks and the building of things, because on one hand, I like to demonstrate how certain things come together. In this case, we wanted to make a change, so we used some unwelded blocks to kind of brace things together so that we could grind out one block, replace it with something else, and then take the braces off, and everything would be absolutely okay. The alternative, of course, being grind that one block and the whole frame comes tumbling down. We didn't want that at all. So didn't want that. And here we've got a space in between each of the large thrusters. That's also very important, because we have to have maneuvering thrusters on this ship. We're not going to get very far if all we can do is up and forward, which is all the thrusters that we have on this ship would be supporting that, either up or forward. So we want to make sure that we've got room for the smaller maneuvering thrusters. We can put them into place. They don't take nearly as many materials as the large thrusters take. But they're hopefully going to be handy. They're going to allow us to get the maneuverability that we need, the ability to hover in place so that we can line up a connector to transfer cargo on and off. That would be kind of nice. And mostly, just putting them in place, seeing how they fit together. You can see this one looks like it would do better one block back, or I guess one block down from this viewpoint, so that it's got the same amount of exposure from the ends. It's just messing around, really. It took about an hour and a half just messing around on this one side of the vehicle to get a feel for how I wanted everything in place. And that's one of the things that I like to do. If there was a really easy, intuitive mirror mode building thing, I would be using it all the time, unless I was specifically doing an asymmetrical build. It's not, you have to use blueprints and stuff from what I understand, which at some point we'll probably get to. We'll have like a base sort of thing that we're happy with, and then we'll use blueprints and duplicate it and then modify it and do all kinds of crazy things. But for getting a build without the mirror mode kind of building feature together, I find it's usually best to do one side and then make the tweaks and additions that come to us right away. Before we do the other side, it just saves a lot of time and confusion. That way we're able to just kind of get everything in place, figure out whether or not we're happy with it, just, you know, that spur of the moment decision, and then duplicate it over on the other side, then making a bunch of little changes on one side and having to duplicate them on the other side because we already did that side too. It gets to be kind of a pain. And now the frame itself is very straightforward, holding the large and the small thrusters. But I wanted to build it out a little bit so that it looked like more than just this kind of stick frame holding all these massive thrusters. So this was, again, another example of spinning blocks and kind of figuring out how I wanted everything to come together. On the inside, I decided I wanted something sort of concave. And then on the outside edge, a little bit convex, so that it just kind of has a shape that flows a little bit more than if we kind of left this single block frame. But nothing too particularly complicated that it's going to take us the rest of our lives to get it in place, and even worse, try and duplicate it on the other side, because that's sometimes one of the things that I've gotten myself in trouble with in other games, is you do something really complicated and really detailed on one side, and then you have to duplicate it over on the other side, and it's a pain in the ass. So we avoided that a little bit just by keeping it relatively simple. And it's also, again, giving us an opportunity to mess around with certain block shapes that we don't normally use. And by experimenting with them, using them in a build, we get a little bit more familiar with them, and they'll be able to come into play more and more in the future when we're doing other builds, because we have that familiarity and the experience with using them. So it's just taking a little bit of time and kind of lining things up. And also, one of the things that I find is the way the rotating of the blocks changes based on your angle of approach. Sometimes with the jetpack, I end up like basically dangling upside down, or I'm above something, or I'm hanging below something, and the way things spin around changes as a result. And it's a little bit tricky to get into a pattern and get into a rhythm with some of these blocks to get them spun around the way that we want them to. Well, we get there. We get there eventually. It's one of the things that's unavoidable if you do it enough times. Just you'll never know how much of this process I edited out just so that you didn't have to suffer through the worst of it. But you can see when it comes together fairly nicely. And then we just duplicate it all the way around. Now the big thing here is the size of the vehicle is a little bit of a concern, because the more blocks we add, the greater the mass, and the greater the mass, the more thrust it's going to require just to move itself. Are we going to be able to still lift the ground-based module, much less the ground-based module when it's full of materials? Or even worse, the ground-based module when it's full of materials after having transferred a bunch of materials to the air-based module. Again, there's only so much that we can do to find out. And I mean, worst case scenario, we can always mess around with transferring inventory back and forth. Get the air-based module so that it can move and transfer inventory from wherever we're drilling to wherever our base is, and then go back and forth and do it that way. We have enough storage that we're going to be moving a very large amount of material, no matter how much we try to kind of keep a limit on it. If we've got 4 million units of storage in each of the 3 containers, compared to the 150,000 that we have on the little red wagon, well, we're going to be able to move quite a lot of stuff. So I'm not too worried about that. But again, it's just a matter of we're going to have to feel it out and be a little bit cautious at first. We also have to do things like tune the wheels and the suspension, which is going to be something that I'm probably going to avoid as much as possible. I'm just going to try and basically get it spotted into place on an ice lake somewhere and dig the hell out of the ice lake. And if the vehicle looks like it's kind of dipping a little bit low on the suspension, then we'll make adjustments. But in terms of trying to make adjustments and testing and things like that on something this size, maybe not the best way to do it. I could see making a small vehicle, like just a little wheeled vehicle, and then taking it out and experimenting with different things, but not something this size. Now this is us in our welder. It took a long time to build this welder. It didn't take a long time to build the first version. It took a long time to build the version that worked, just because we overlooked a couple of details. But now we can carry 150,000 liters worth of stuff instead of the just 4,000 liters that we can carry, in a regular player character. And we can fly around and we can weld things with those materials, which is quite handy. Especially, it would have been even better if we had built it in time to do the large thrusters, but for now, even it's quite a handy benefit to be able to do it with these smaller ones. They don't take nearly as much in terms of materials, but they still take enough to justify having a ship where we can fly around and do all this stuff. And we're actually going to be taking a look at the build process for this little welder once we're done with the Blue Behemoth. So if you're wondering kind of what it looks like from the outside and how it all works and how it all went together, there will be an opportunity for you to see that in the not too distant future. But for now, we're just finishing off getting all the thrusters welded up, and then once the thrusters are welded up, we can do the finishing touches. If you've seen the thumbnail for the video, you know that we're actually a little bit farther ahead in the build for this ship, and the reason why is because all that's really required after we're done welding up the thrusters is a little bit of structural work leading up to a cockpit, which was, again, just spinning blocks. There wasn't anything particularly crucial about demonstrating that. We'll take a look at it before we take it out for a spin, but it's not going to be a 5-minute discussion on how we built a wall leading to a cockpit. We have to put some landing gears on. We have to put some connectors on that will be attached to pistons so that we can connect to the umbilical up at the top section of our base to unload materials whenever we have stuff stored on this ship. And then it's basically just setting up the controls, and we'll be off to the ice lake. So if you want to be notified when we go to the ice lake and do that tour of the ship, and all the other videos that we're going to do on space engineers and everything else, you can subscribe to my channel. You can also follow me on social media. Links for social media are in the information box below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.